Bill, tell me a little bit about your time when you went to Columbia University and how you got into the Chinese poetry and translations and meditation.
What got me to go to Columbia was when I got out of the Army. Um, I originally flunked out of Santa Barbara in '61, studying art, and then flunked out of Palomar College in '62, studying psychology, and then in '64 I flunked out of Pasadena City College studying English. Got drafted. Just happened to have a German girlfriend. She was going to go back to Germany. So when you get drafted, you at that time you serve for 2 years, but they had a special program. If you were willing to add an extra year, you could get any training they had available or any duty assignment. So I signed up for Europe for the extra year, and eventually I went to Europe, did my Army tour. Didn't have to go to Vietnam. Um, and when I got out, after spending a few years in the Army, I was wondering how I'm going to spend this life, and but I wanted to go back to college, and I decided on anthropology because I thought, well, I can learn all about these different ways people in the world live their lives, and then I can choose one or put one together. Yeah. And so that's why I chose anthropology. And by the time I was 3 years later, when I graduated in 1970, the I'd been reading works by several anthropologists who taught at Columbia University. Marvin Harris was a prominent one. Of course, Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict were there. So I decided to go to grad school. And of course, I didn't want to have to go get a job. So sometimes when you're going to school, you just keep going to school as long as you can. So I thought I'd go to Columbia and do some graduate work in anthropology. But I didn't have enough money. I pretty much used up the GI Bill, which is $175 a month. That was just about gone. I may have had one semester left of it, but so I needed a fellowship, and I'd read a book called The Way of Zen by Alan Watts several months before I applied to, and I'd seen all these Chinese characters in the book, and I really liked Zen. His book about Zen really resonated with some of the things I'd been thinking about, and so on this application for a language fellowship, that was one of the ones that looked good to me. Like I qualified. You had to be an American citizen, and it had to be a rare language in 1970 for an American. So just on a whim, I wrote in the word Chinese. I had really no interest in China or Chinese. It was just I was just going through the checking boxes on the application, and they gave me a 4-year fellowship, and which was so embarrassing because I had no interest in this. I was a fraud. I talked to my aunt, and she paid for me that summer. My aunt Pearline paid for my to go to the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies to learn some Chinese that summer, so I would arrive at Columbia not looking like a fraud. And so I spent that summer getting learning the basics about Chinese. And then I went to Columbia, and my fellowship required me to take a course called Intensive Chinese. It's 5 days a week, 3 hours in the morning, 9 to 12, with this woman called Loretta Pan, amazing woman. Everybody called her, when she was not to her face, but everybody called her the Dragon Lady. And she was in every sense of that. She was the Dragon Lady. We started with the class was I think it was around 25, 26 students, and within about 3 weeks, she was down to four of us were left. Two of the students were there. They were sent there by the CIA to because we were bombing Cambodia then, and they were sending certain people who already knew Laotian, the languages of that area, to learn a little bit about Chinese too. So there's just me and this other guy who, and after after a couple more weeks, the Loretta Professor Pond said, "Mr. Porter, I want you to stay after class." And after everybody left, said, "Mr. Porter, I only teach the best, and you're not good enough. I want you to drop the class." And so I said, "But I can't. My fellowship requires me to take this class." And so she said, "Well, I don't care. As far as I'm concerned, you're not here anymore." And so I would come to class, and I wasn't there anymore. Finally, I complained to the Hans Bielenstein, was this great sinologist, Swedish sinologist, was at the department. I complained about the treatment, and he made her recognize me. And she got even by giving me a D for the class, which canceled my fellowship. And I had to take a special proctored exam to restore the fellowship by getting a B in this special exam. So that was my introduction to Chinese. It was really a hard language. It's weird. I had no reason to like it, put it that way, because I'd never read any books about China or Chinese literature or anything like that. I was just interested in anthropological theory. Very much interested in phenomenology. I took courses in Santa Barbara before I got to Columbia in computer programming, finite mathematics, symbolic logic. So I was approaching anthropology differently. And I didn't know what I was going to do with all that information, those skills, but I thought I needed them. And Chinese was not something that was just going to pay the bills. But anyway, it was in New York, and I met a monk, and Chinese monk, and started meditating. He taught me how to meditate, and I started spending weekends with him up in the Hudson. He had a place in the countryside. And by the end of the second year, I realized I was so impressed with who he was. I'd never met anybody like that before, who was a practitioner. He didn't just talk because he couldn't talk. He couldn't speak any English, and my Chinese was not good. But I was impressed with the kind of person he was. And so by the end of the second year, I told him, well, as well as I could, that this is a path I wanted to follow. And so he recommended Taiwan as a place where I could practice. I couldn't go to China because it was the Cultural Revolution, and it didn't make any sense to go to Japan or Sri Lanka because I didn't know those languages, but I knew some Chinese. And one of my classmates that was forced out of the class, Professor Pan's class, had been to Taiwan and met somebody there who could be my sponsor. You had to have a sponsor then. And so I gave up the last 2 years of the fellowship and just, again, relied on my Aunt Pearline to buy me a one-way ticket to Taiwan.
So tell me a little bit about, I know you went to several different, spent time at several different monasteries. Tell me sort of briefly about each of those and how one led to the other.
Well, the monastery where this German friend at Columbia had met this girl was at this brand new monastery in southern Taiwan. There wasn't much Buddhism in Taiwan when the KMT fled China and set up shop in Taiwan. There's just sort of rudimentary things. So this was actually one of the first major monasteries was being built in the southern end of Taiwan, and this German had happened to go there while traveling around the island and met this girl, and she became my sponsor. So I went to that monastery. It was called Fo Guangshan, a Buddha Light monastery. And the only thing I'd read about Buddhism, especially Chinese Buddhism, was Zen. I just took it for granted that everything's Zen, and it wasn't. It was a Pure Land monastery. So that surprised me. I mean, they gave me my own room, and I had never been a vegetarian before, but the diet is vegetarian, and it's wonderful food they made. There were about 300 monks and nuns, and they had classes in the morning where I'd study Buddhist texts. In the afternoon, we'd carry cement and stuff to help build the, the, the abbot's plans. A very famous monk, Xing Yun. He died about 3 years ago. He was the first person who really introduced mega Buddhism to China, to Taiwan. As to say, there would be sometimes thousands of people there, but at least hundreds. And so I sort of felt uncomfortable there because I was a foreigner. And Pure Land Buddhism is all chanting and prostrations. That's really not what I had in mind as a practice. But they treated me great. But after a year, I decided I'd rather go to a Zen monastery, and I found out again through my sponsor where there was one, and so I then spent about 2.5 years at a Zen monastery. Where, again, the abbot. I mean, and at these monasteries, they'd never seen a foreigner before, so they didn't know what to do with me. I mean, if I'd gone to Japan, they had a system that they would for foreigners. They just would have plugged me in, and I'd be doing that. But they left me alone a lot, so I had a lot of time to do whatever I wanted to do, which was to read texts, and I'd try to find a English translation of a text, and then I would read that along with the original Chinese to see how the Buddhist language works, because it's like when you read the Bible. There's a certain kind of English, biblical English, you could say, and the Chinese had sutra language, you might say. So you have to sort of get used to terminology and ways of using the language. So I sort of got into that, and even at the first monastery, but at this other Zen monastery where I was there for about 2.5 years. I would spend like probably 6 hours a day reading texts on my own.
What kind of texts?
Zen texts.
Okay.
Talks by Zen masters recorded during the Tang Dynasty or Song Dynasty, for which I could get an English translation. And after I was there for about a year and a half or so, the abbot called me in his office and gave me this book that he had helped finance the publication, and it was the poems of Cold Mountain. And I'd heard of Han Shan or Cold Mountain from reading Gary Snyder, Jack Kerouac's Dharma Bums, which was dedicated to Han Shan. So I was really surprised that suddenly I had his poems in my hand. And I started reading them, and it turns out he was the first poet in Chinese history of any significance who wrote poetry in the vernacular. And of course, it's poetry meant to communicate. Whereas a lot of the more famous poets in China write in a very fancy style often. It can be difficult. But Cold Mountain's poems were so easy. I could understand them, and so I started translating them. But you know, again, when I lived in these monasteries, I was a guest, not just an ordinary guest. I was an honored guest. You see, my sponsor, this woman, she was about my same age as me. She was in her late 20s. She graduated in art from college, but her father was the commander of the Taiwan Navy, and he was responsible for bringing the Taiwan government, the KMT, out of China. He was the fleet commander that brought everybody from China. So he was a national hero. So they didn't want to mess with me in a sense. They don't. I tried to sweep. They wouldn't let me sweep. They wouldn't let me do anything. So I felt that I was really taking advantage of their hospitality is there. And then finally, at one point, the abbot called me into his office, his room, So we just got a phone call from the American embassy. Your father died. And a week later, I got a letter from my father, and my father never wrote me. And he wrote me this letter that in a hand scrawl, and it was about 2 lines. It was, you've been over there 3 or 4 years now. Isn't it time you did something productive with your life, Dad? So that resonated with me. Like I say, the fact that my father thought I wasn't being productive, the fact that I was living in a monastery, freeloading in a sense, not not able to do anything to earn my living, but I moved to a farming village outside of Taipei on the mountain, lived there for the next 14 years. Because again, my sponsor had a neighbor in Taipei who had these farm sheds that he had converted to rentals, and so I was able to live in the mountains and meditate um, and practice calligraphy. My sponsor also introduced me to my calligraphy teacher, who just happened to be the most famous calligrapher in Taiwan, and who was the curator of the Palace Museum. In those days, there were so few foreigners who were interested in Chinese culture. Everybody, any foreigner you'd meet in Taiwan was involved in the Vietnam War. So they really welcomed anybody wanting to learn about Chinese calligraphy or Buddhism or anything. So I would study calligraphy and uh, I started translating these poems of Cold Mountain, and eventually an American, again, because there were so few Americans in Taiwan who were not involved in the war effort. There'd be usually gatherings, parties on the weekends, and sooner or later, if you arrived in Taiwan, within a few weeks, you'd find out what everybody was doing. Like whether you're practicing a martial art or Chinese painting or whatever, Chinese medicine. And so somebody came up the mountain and knocked on my door. His name is Mike O'Connor, and he said, "I hear you're working on the poems of Coal Mountain. Do you need a publisher?" And I'd already got tried. I'd sent my poems, my translations to three presses trying to get them published. I thought, well, that's what you should do, right? I They were turned down by Tuttle, Weatherhill, and even Shambhala, and I don't blame them at all, because I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't know what translation meant, and I was translating poems, and I don't write poetry. Never written poetry. Probably never will. It's not something I tell people. For me, writing a poem is like going on a dance stage and dancing. Translation is like seeing somebody dancing on the dance stage and going up and joining them. And so that's what appealed to me about translation, and that's why I kept doing it, even though my translation sucked. But Mike kept telling me, "Bill, your translations suck because you're not making poems. You're just translating words into English words." And so eventually I started developing a voice, a translation voice. And it takes a while, because now that I can look back at 40 years of translating, it's like you're discovering two voices. First, you have to discover the voice under the words. You can't translate the words. The Chinese. For me, the Chinese text on the page is it's a it's the last ditch attempt by the Chinese poet to say something, but it's not really what they meant, because those are just words, and and words don't really represent our feelings. They try to, or our ideas. And so a translator has to find out where those words are coming from. In fact, the earliest definition of poetry in China was 在心法. Let's see, it's like words. Poetry is words from the heart, whereas prose you could say is words from the head. You know, but poetry is all about the heart. That's the way the Chinese viewed it. And so, knowing that, I kept working at trying to find that voice under the words, and then with Mike's help, trying to find my own voice, because that's what it is. It is two dance partners, but it's not the words on the page.
Yeah.
Either the Chinese or my English. It's developing a way that the words represent a harmony, that's underneath the words. And so that's what really attracted me to translation. The more I translated, the more I realized it's a performance art. But it's an internal performance that you sort of do your internal dance. And so, anyway, that's how I got into translation, and one poet would lead to another, because just would discover, for example, Coal Mountain um, wasn't really well known, but I could get editions of his works, and I got one edition, a Qing Dynasty woodblock edition, and after his poems, there was another guy named Stonehouse, a monk, Buddhist monk, and his poems were even better. So I started translating those poems too. And after a while, I got married, had kids, needed a job, started working at a radio station in Taiwan. It's the old U.S. Army station that we abandoned when we recognized China, but it was still an English language station. And everybody in Taiwan wanted to listen to the station to practice their English. So it was there were jobs available, and they got a grant from the Asia Foundation to do local news, and they hired me to come in every morning at 5 o'clock in the morning and read all the major newspapers, and then translate stories for the morning news, and then during the day interview people who were in the news. So I did that for a while, and eventually I wondered, Coal Mountain is sort of like this hermit figure. He lived in a cave, and then wrote poems on rock walls and trees, and his poems were collected. And this other man, Stonehouse, he lived in a hut for 35 years on top of the mountain. And I was not only impressed with the poetry, but the kind of lifestyle that it came out of. This Chinese attitude toward the seeking solitude. And so I wondered if that was a literary conceit, or whether people were really like that. So I called up one of the men who I'd interviewed, a man named Winston Wong, who's the son of Wang Yongqing, the richest man in Taiwan. And Winston was the head of the world's biggest plastics company, Formosa Plastics. I'd once interviewed him, and I'd asked him if he'd seen the movie The Graduate, and asked him, and he said, "Yeah." So I said, well, "What would you tell a graduate?" And I was expecting, plastics, son, plastics,
Right.
right? But he said, "No, I tell him to follow the Tao." So I was really impressed with him, and we sort of hit it off. And so at one point, just out of the blue, I got this idea to go to China and look for hermits. And I called him up and told him about this. He said, "How much do you need?" And so he gave me, I said, "Well, maybe around $5,000. And he said, "You want it in cash or traveler's checks?" I went down, got the money, and then I called up a friend in Port Townsend who I'd met, who's a photographer, and asked him if he'd want to come over and join me, take photographs, and then go find hermits. And we went to China. We arrived in Beijing on May Day. It was it's the big celebration day in China normally, and usually there's military parades and all this, but not this May Day. All of Tiananmen, all of Beijing was students protesting. It was like a celebration. Like anyway, so I arrived that day at May Day, and then the next day I went to this Buddhist monastery in Beijing, where the headquarters of the Buddhist Association was located, and I just happened to run into a monk, and I told him, I'm looking for hermits. Where I could find some hermits? And he said, "Well, I'm not sure, but I think there's still some in the Jungnan Mountains. I didn't even know where the Jungnan Mountains were, and I didn't. And in Chinese, there's no difference between a singular noun and a plural noun. There is no S. So I didn't know if it was one mountain or what. I asked around. I found out it was there a huge range of mountains south of Xi'an. And so me and Steve Johnson, the photographer friend, went there and um, got in a taxi and asked the taxi this woman who drove the taxi to she could just drop us off at the foot of these mountains and then come back in 2 days. So we hiked in the mountains, and within a few hours, I'm writing down hermit addresses on the and the monks, the hermits I'm meeting I'm making drawings in the dirt, about well, this guy lives over here up that valley, and this guy over here, and so eventually I write this book called Road to Heaven, about meeting these people seeking solitude, and then publishing it in America um, under this title, Road to Heaven. It was about 20 years, let's see, about 10, 12, 13 years later, it was translated into Chinese, published in China. Um, it sold over 2 million copies. It turns out the hermit tradition in China is one of the most important parts of Chinese society and Chinese civilization. I mean, hermits in our culture are misanthropes. They want to be left alone, and they want you to leave them alone. Hermits in China, and again, I don't know what other word to use other than hermit. It's not quite the right word because they're not like our hermits, what we call hermits. But they're people who are spiritual seekers who have a certain advanced degree of training, who then go live alone in the mountains. It's the spiritual PhD program in China. You go get your PhD and then you come down the mountain. About 90% of the hermits come down the mountain. And usually it's about your time in the mountains about 3 to 5 years.
Your book helped reintroduce um, Chinese people to their own culture,
Yeah, it did.
and that's why it resonated so much over there.
Well, people, everybody I asked, like the last person I interviewed in Taiwan was the head of relations with China, and eventually he became the president of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou. And he said, "There's not even any real monks or nuns in China, much less hermits. You're wasting your time." And everybody I asked said, "Oh, there's no hermits in China." But I went and I found all this tradition alive and well. I mean, it, it's not everywhere in China. In fact, if you, maybe 1% of the mountains in China have hermits. They always have some relationship. I mean, the location, the mountain has a relationship of hundreds of years with a cultural center, usually within 100 miles. And so, because these people are going into the mountain for training, advanced training, but it's all solo training. You can't if you didn't have that training, you wouldn't last one winter. You'd get cold, you get hungry, you come back down. But there's certain spiritual seekers who can benefit by being alone. It's after meeting these people and writing about it, I've discovered basically what it comes down to is finding your own voice, and you can tell someone who's speaking from their own voice, or whether they're just saying what their teacher taught them, or what they read in a book. So that's why these people uh, became the great teachers. In fact, I've read hundreds of biographies of Buddhists in China and Taoists, and you can't find one who was not a hermit, that did not undergo this period of solitude. It's really an important time for your practice to spend time alone. I mean, but of course, at the beginning, you're meditating and practicing with other people, and that's also really important because if you try to be a solo practitioner at the beginning, you're not going to go anywhere. Maybe 1 in 1,000 might benefit by being a solo practitioner, but the hermit tradition is for advanced students. When I got to Taiwan, I was living in these large monasteries where people meditated. Well, they didn't really. I didn't go to any monasteries where people meditated together in Taiwan, but in China I did.
Yeah.
Because again, Buddhism was sort of new in Taiwan because there really hadn't been any Buddhism until the nationalists retreated to Taiwan and brought some of the old masters from Taiwan, from China, but then they died and went to Los Angeles, after a few years in Taiwan. So there really wasn't much of any Buddhism except this monastery I started practicing in. But they're all doing Pure Land practice, where people don't meditate. You just chant and do prostrations. But in China, when I started traveling in China, I started living in monasteries, not for long periods because I was on a visitor's visa, a tourist visa, but I would go to monasteries and stay a week, and they have meditation halls where people meditate together, and I had never experienced that before, but it was so much more powerful than meditating in your own room.
Why?
Just other people, just the vibes.
Yeah.
You mean you just the knowledge that other people are doing the same thing. It's just it's a yeah, vibes. The idea that other people are meditating with you, and it's encouraging you to continue your meditation when you start feeling a little sleepy, or your knees ache a little bit. You just anyway. And plus, it just meant I was doing this as part of a community. Rather than just on my own. And communal practice was really important. In fact, Zen began as a spiritual sect by founding the first agricultural communes in China. All monks and nuns in China were not vegetarians. They ate whatever they were given, which included meat. It wasn't until Zen began around the year, say around 600 or so, 600 AD, that these communes were formed, and where people supplied their own food. They grew their own food, and fortunately, they had a great protein in tofu. So they still got good protein from beans. And rice and wheat flour and stuff like that, and lots of vegetables. So these agricultural communes would self-supporting communes formed in the Zen sect, not in the Pure Land sect or other sects. So communal practice became the heart of and the secret behind the ascent of Zen to being the most powerful and most widespread practice of the spiritual path in China, beginning around the year 600, 700 until modern times. I would say nowadays Zen is not so important as it was. Mainly, the Cultural Revolution destroyed a lot of practice centers, and so it's much easier to practice Pure Land Buddhism, where you just chant and do prostrations, rather than and which of course you do together, which is a communal practice, and also powerful. I admired when I was living in my first monastery. It was a powerful thing to do with other people, even though it wasn't the practice that I liked. I like to meditate with people.
So we'll come back around to how that experience, in part, is what gave you the idea of creating a community meditation center here in Port Townsend.
But when I came back here, I was really I really missed meditating with other people, as I had done in to some extent in Taiwan and a lot in China, and I kept bugging the people I would meet here in Port Townsend because many of the Taiwan has a lot of woodworkers because of the boat building here, and I wondered why? And I've discovered that when I moved to Port Townsend that many people were Buddhists or were sympathetic towards Buddhist practice, and I wondered, why can't we just get a little bit of money together, buy a piece of land, and all you guys have skills, we could build a place. And so I've always had this dream of building a place where people can meditate together. And it wasn't until recently that we found a building. Me and another friend found a building at Fort Worden here in Port Townsend that was available, that had been abandoned, and we were unable to get the state's Parks Commission to agree to let us take it over. But it got us started thinking in setting up a community meditation hall. And the fact that it was this idea began at Fort Worden meant it was going to be on state property, which meant it has to be ecumenical. You can't just build a Buddhist monastery on public land. So when we got turned down by the park, we realized that being forced to be ecumenical was, rather than a detriment, was the best thing we could possibly do. Because I give talks at a lot around America at Zen centers, and Zen centers, there are a number that are thriving, but they tend to the practitioners generally are people as old as I am, and there might be a few young people, but it, they're doing their chants maybe in Japanese, and they're wearing robes and stuff. And it always occurred to me that there are a lot of people who would like to do this practice, but they feel a little hesitant because they don't feel that they belong to that tradition, because they don't want to have to learn Japanese or Chinese or wear robes or learn the secret handshake, basically. So our idea was, let's make a center that is just open for people like Catholic churches. You can go in and pray anytime. We thought, what about a place where you can go in and meditate anytime, and you don't have to be a Buddhist or anything. It's just a place to meditate, as if you could, you have a place where you can do yoga or Tai Chi Chuan. So that was the idea that we came up with, and then because we couldn't do this on public land, we ended up buying some land, and then we started working on designing a communal meditation hall. And we happened to, when I came up with this idea and mentioned it to the friends I'd made in Taiwan and in Port Townsend after a poetry reading, there was one of the guys I know who said, "Hey, if you guys do this, I'll make you a bell." His name was Tom J. And Tom J's college roommate, when he first started studying art at Pomona College in 64, 65, was an artist named James Turrell, who was a light artist. And then when I mentioned Turrell's name, and other members of this group trying to build a meditation hall said, "Oh, I have a contact with him too." So we got in touch with James Turrell, and he agreed to design our meditation hall. And so we bought some property. We signed a place where people can not just meditate together, but be inspired by even just being in the building, designed by Turrell and built by a really great architect in Seattle named Jim Olson. So that's where we are sort of right now. We're just finishing up the final design, and getting ready to start raising money to build the building, and to open up to see whether this will work. We're sort of like building it and to see who comes.
So, are there other places like this
Nobody's ever
in the U.S.?
No.
For example, where you don't need to know the secret handshake.
No. Well, there are. They're private. Well, they're places like Spirit Rock and Usually, these places belong to a religious tradition, a Buddhist or Taoist, or they belong to somebody who is an inspiring teacher who gets financial support, and they buy some land and build a meditation center. But then you have to pay to go to use these facilities. And generally it's very rare that they're inside a city. They're in the countryside on the mountain, and where it's quiet. But our idea is a community meditation hall can be and should be something like a community swimming pool that people in a town can benefit from meditation just like they can by going to the swimming pool, but in a different way. It's not about learning how to swim and losing some weight and practicing physical exercises, but it's coming to a place to forget the world. That was the most important thing that I learned about when I got to Taiwan and I got in that first monastery. The world disappeared. All the things that had stressed me out living in America, were gone. One time, there was a very famous Tibetan yogi named Milarepa, great teacher, one of the greatest of all Tibetan teachers. And a student once came to him and said, "Master, what's the easiest way to become enlightened?" He said, "Leave your country." When we live in a society, we live with a certain way of looking at things and seeing what's real and what's good and what's bad. And it's like there are all these walls that we surround ourselves with. And when we can leave our country, just take a little trip. Suddenly you're in Mexico or whatever, and people do things differently. And you realize it's not like you can act crazy or anything, but it means you have choices. You realize that you have choices on what you want to, how you want to see the world. And to me, going to Taiwan, that really opened up things for me. Is that I can decide how I want to view this life, and so I benefited by having that freedom. The fact that they just left me alone, and it's like I said when I got out of the army, I was going to study anthropology so I could choose how I wanted to live by studying the Hopi or the Cheyennes or other people, how they did things. Not that I learned the rain dance or how to count coup, but anyway, I learned that I could choose my own way of life, and I had the luxury of being able to make those choices because I arrived in Taiwan free. I arrived in Taiwan with $13. No, that's not true. 213. Like my father had given me two $100 bills when he said goodbye at the airport. So I had $213, and after about 2 years, I still had that 200. The 13 I spent, but nobody would let me spend money. I was cared for by all these monks and nuns and just people in general. They would not. If I needed something, they would provide it.
So to what extent do you imagine this community meditation hall being for people in the immediate local community versus people who come from other places who hear about it and want to make, coming here part of their own journey?
Well, this town, the Port Townsend, where our center is going to be located in, it gets a good deal of tourism on the weekends, although not year round, mainly in the summer. But so there's always going to be people coming here just to spend the weekend. But our idea is to make meditation part of a community's daily lives. It's like on the way to the store, stopping in and meditating, or coming back from the store, or what. We've also, the land we bought is located in the geographic center of Port Townsend. not on the periphery, not in the countryside. So it's within walking distance of a lot of people. Bicycle distance, even more. There's a bus stop right across the street, so it's accessible to anybody who just wants to go meditate. And then the thing about it is you you get to know your not just your neighbors but new neighbors by being sitting together in meditation.
So are these, and maybe it's both, sort of organized or structured or regular sessions with a guide or someone who's,
No,
so it's all sort of, say a little bit about how to work.
yeah. Well, our idea is that because James Turrell is designing this hall, and he's such a famous artist, there are a lot of people who are just going to want to come and look. So we come up with the idea. Well, we'll do a 30-minute meditation. Begins on the hour, ends on the half hour, and then there's 30 minutes for people to leave and people to come in and look. But if you're there, and the door, and if you're inside on the hour, then you've got to stay inside and meditate, or just sit down and be quiet. Our idea is everybody's going to have a different meditation practice. Many people won't have any idea what meditation is at all, but we're going to. Our staff will be totally, except for an executive director. The place will be run by volunteers, and so it'll stay open. It'll open up in the morning and close at night as early as possible and as late as possible, but depending on availability of volunteers, because we probably want probably 3 volunteers at any one time, because we have 2 meditation halls. The Trail Hall, and our building is on a slope, so on the lower level we have a hall that's just open all the time. But the Trail Hall will be open just for that 30-minute meditation session where the door closes. And then the second half hour is for people to come in and they just want to see how it looks, because it's going to be a sky space hall with a hole in the ceiling where the sky sort of comes right into the room. So that's basically our idea, that we'll have 2 different halls, so people who just want to meditate anytime and not have to be there at a certain time can come into the lower hall and stay as long as they want. Whereas in the Terrell Hall, it'll be strictly a 30-minute meditation. But it'll open up in the morning as early as possible and stay open as late as possible, depending on.
But you imagine, will meditation groups from other areas come here and spend a weekend or whatever, or
Sure, yeah,
okay.
yeah. We're the basic hall is for the community. It's for just to transmit this idea that meditation is something you can practice in your daily life and with your neighbors and with people in the community, and it'll be more powerful if you do that rather than just in your living room. But we're going to welcome anybody who wants to come here as a group that has their own you might say community of meditators, and if they want to rent it, although the chances are they won't be renting it all day.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll come here as a group, and maybe they want certain hours, and so we don't have any lodging on our property, so if people are going to have a retreat, we'd have to work something out with some of the hotels or Fort Worden, so that people could stay here as a group. But
so James Turrell's a very famous guy among people who know who he is, but for people who don't, what's the significance or the importance or the meaning of his piece of this meditation hall?
Well, it's the experience of being able to sit in a hall where the sky is inside the hall, which is a liberating feeling. So it's not a box,
Yeah.
in a closed box, but it's an open box. So it's sort of, the building itself is sort of a metaphor for your mind,
Yeah.
and that people can experience that. They don't have to know anything about James Turrell.
So I knew of James Turrell over the years. I've heard of him, but I didn't really understand his work with light. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in Phoenix, and we went to his installation at Arizona State University. And it's hard to quite kind of get Turrell unless you experience it. And this place was amazing. We went there at sunset, and just before sunset, and stayed in this space for 2 hours until it was dark. And over that period of time, there's the interior perimeter is lit up with different colors of light, different intensities of light. And as the sky gets progressively darker over this, hour long period or whatever, and the lights, he's got some idea with the lighting. It's just the color of the light outside in the sky and the world changes, and just remarkably so. And it's magical. Yeah, it really is.
That's what we think that people will be impressed with that too.
It's an ambitious project, and there's a certain group of people who are meditators, and there's another group of people who are, artists, patrons of the arts, and you see this appealing to both of them. Can you talk about that?
Well, I wouldn't want to separate them,
Okay.
because I think people who aren't patrons of the arts probably maybe don't even have a painting or on their walls at home. By just going in that hall, will gain an appreciation for that art. It's like it's a little different from the Sistine Chapel, but you don't have to be a Christian to go in the Sistine Chapel and be there to appreciate the the power that art has to sort of transform your feelings and broaden your horizons, you might say. So I think anybody will be able to benefit by that, whether they're interested in art or not.
Yeah.
And that's the underlying thing, because it's patrons of the arts will come, people who are just interested in the work of Turrell, of course, and that's wonderful. But our idea is we're to do everything we can to liberate this community, and that the art will help. Like I say, having that as a meditation space will give us a leg up on achieving what we want to do. Whereas if it was just a regular meditation hall with a regular ceiling and everything, well, we wouldn't have that advantage.
Yeah.
Because this will open things up for people who wouldn't otherwise have them opened up. And I'm talking about their minds.
Yeah, kind of, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about trips I've taken to Europe, and many people have, where you can go into one of so many churches and you don't have to know anything about, Catholicism, for example, to appreciate being in the space. And it's a moving experience, often when I've gone in to places like that. Tell me about your own meditation practice today.
Well, mine is pretty simple. I just meditate every morning, with my legs crossed and sitting on some cushions, and just breathe, lose myself in my breath. It's in Zen meditation, you don't meditate on things. There's different Buddhist practices involve meditation on subjects, on mandalas, for example, the Tibetan visualization of the universe as a mandala and your mind as a mandala, or meditating on a phrase on koans. There's and that's why one of the advantages we see our place having is that we're not going to have any one kind of meditation. We're not going to tell anybody how to meditate unless they ask us. And then we'll have different volunteers who practice different traditions, um, instruct if when asked, maybe insight meditation or TM uh, or Tibetan meditation. We'll find out who locally can give instruction and provide instruction when needed. And we'll also, there's one person who will probably be a paid salary person, the executive director. Their basic job will be to bring in people who can add a spiritual dimension to meditation.
What would that look like?
It would bring in teachers who practitioners. For example, there's a man who I contacted some time ago about coming here to provide exactly this kind of service. His name is Paul Canon, and he's the abbot of Gethsemane. So who teaches Christian contemplation. So we would find I know some Taoist teachers who would be perfect for coming here and teaching Taoist meditation. So and they probably spend at least a weekend, maybe a whole week, depending on interest. But and there are a lot of Buddhists in this town, and they have teachers, but the teachers are in Los Angeles or wherever, and we could help finance their teacher coming to this town and explaining the teaching of that tradition to others. So the idea is to let people know meditation is really important, but you can do different things with it. It can be part of a spiritual life as well as, because people will at the beginning might think of it, well, this is just good for my health, and it is, and relieving people of their stress because you get so attached to things and learning to let things go. But then maybe you need somebody talks to you about why you should let things go, because there are no things in the first place, and then trying to deal with that, and being able to. We figure we'll bring in spiritual teachers on a regular basis to talk to the community, whoever is interested in different spiritual paths that incorporate meditation or contemplation, whether it's a Sufi or a Christian priest or a Buddhist monk.
I imagine the world in which we live in now, this could potentially be more helpful to people than ever.
Probably the worst thing a person experiences, other than just the trauma of being a war, is stress, credit card debt, whatever, the kind of things that just drive you crazy and make you old fast. But meditation can help break through all stress more than anything. It's better than a pill. There are no side effects, no bad side effects.
Yeah.
And again, it's going to be donation only. It's accessible to anybody who wants to do it, is our idea. And come, as long as it's open, you can come here and meditate, and you'll be with other people, not just in your living room, because naturally you can do that, but this will be more powerful.
Yeah.
And you can do this in James Turrell's Sky Space Hall too.
So I want to go back for a minute to your work and its continuing work with translations, and you can see the through line between all the meditation you did over the years in Taiwan that continues today. What's the connection with the translation work and meditation?
Well, I use this image of dancing a lot, but that's just with poetry. But I also translate Buddhist texts, and for that I use meditation. Mm-hmm. As I told you, I don't usually meditate on anything. I just meditate with following my breath. Mm-hmm. But if I'm translating, that's not true. Then I use my daily meditation to solve translation problems.
Oh,
I'll just like people will meditate on a koan, on a set of words with some kind of a riddle. You know, the sound of one hand clapping is, of course, the famous one. But I will take those Chinese words, you know, that line I'm having a problem studying or translating, and I'll just make that my meditation for the day, and just let that line sit there. Just watch it, look at it,
yeah,
and in my mind, just focus on not thinking about it. Just look at that line,
yeah,
and it works every time. It's amazing. Just let
yeah.
the words will just
Unfold.
unfold. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just amazing. So, you know, meditation's really important for me for when I do Buddhist in translation. To me, meditation is transformative, and a lot of people are afraid to engage in it because they feel they have to put on some robes or become a part of a member of some organization. But here, it's like I say, it's just a swimming pool.
Yeah.
You just have to show up,
Yeah.
sit down, and shut up.
Yeah. Well, Bill, this has been a good interview. Thank you very much for helping us understand more about you and meditation and your work over the last many years.
Well, thank you, Dean, for inviting me.
Yeah. Okay. Good to meet with you. Thank you.
You too.